Okay, we're going to discuss a little bit of the issues of the historical developments that surrounded the time of the Hashmonaim and the rebellion of the Hashmonaim and eventually the holiday of Hanukah. Through this we hope to understand a little bit more about the history, as well as part of the message maybe about the holiday of Hanukah. Really, the historical significance of what is Hanukah really begins about over 150 years before the Mered Hashmonaim, in order to put it in its proper perspective. And I'm going to go through some of the dates, and I hope I'm not going to bore you with too many dates, but it's important to understand it in its historical significance, because as we'll see, that proper historical understanding of when Hanukah and how it happened will give us also help into the message of the holiday. In the year 332, Alexander the Great conquers the Middle East. This represents the first time that a European power enters in and enters into the Middle East. He conquers a large portion of what's known as the Middle East, Syria, Transjordan, Palestine then, which is Israel, and Egypt. And at this point, Alexander the Great merged two cultures during his conquest. He merged the Hellenic Greek culture with that of the Near Eastern culture and branded a new culture which he thought would be the superior culture, which we'll talk about, which is called Hellenism. Alexander the Great did not live long to benefit the fruits of his conquest. He died in the year 323. From the year 323 to 301, there were great internal struggles as to who would take over his mighty empire. Finally, in the year 301, the war seemed to end. And there seems to be a division between the generals. This division among the generals happened even at the time, right after he died, but the conquest and the battles, specifically over Palestine, lasted till 301. In Egypt, the rulers of Egypt were called the Ptolemaic Empire, and they ruled Egypt. And in Syria, it was called the Seleucid Empire. And they battled as who would control the very important connection between Syria and Egypt, which is Eretz Israel, Palestine, which was then called Judea. In 301, the Egyptian Ptolemaic Empire assumes control over Palestine. And at that point, internally in Judea, the person that was really in control, not only the religious power, but the authoritative government power, was the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol was, for all intents and purposes, the leader of Judea. Now, as this happens, there were different Kohanim Gedolim. And there was some level of corruption in the leadership of the Kehunah. This is recorded in the Gemara, which talks about many Kohanim Gedolim entering Kodesh Kodashim and not coming out alive because their motives were less than pure. One example of that is in the year 242, at that point the legitimate Kohen Gadol's name was from the Hanukah family, in English the Anayid family, was deposed because he had an argument with Talmai, and what was put in from the Egyptian leader, his name was Yosef ben Tobiah, which created a rivalry between the Tobiah family and the Hanukah family. But nevertheless, we see already precedent that the leadership of the Kehunah is being usurped and is actually being dictated by non-Jewish rulers. This act itself is not such an important act among itself, but as we'll see later, this is a key element to part of the revolution of the Hashmonaim. And we're going to see what that means. In the year 201, Antiochus the Great, Antiochus III, after many wars, finally takes advantage of the death of one of the Egyptian emperors and the youth of the successor, and he enters into Judea. And in the year 198, the Seleucid Empire, the Syrian Empire, is firmly in control under the leadership of Antiochus III of Judea. Antiochus III reaffirms the rights of all Jews to live according to their ancestral law. Okay, this is a very important affirmation, because that was the basic practice of the Egyptians. And now Antiochus III is saying that in the new power, in the new conquest of Antiochus III, that will be the power, the policy. And this is not only received by the Kohen Gadol, but by the acting council of the time. And we know throughout the history of the Jewish people, there were councils that also shared power with the Kohen Gadol. Whether if it was in the time of Ezra and Shekris Tagdolah, later the Sanhedrin or Beit Din Hagadol, these were courts that were not just a court system, but also acted in somewhat as a governing body of the Jewish people. And we know, by the way, also that this was recognized by the foreign powers as a governing body, because we know that we have some, when Antiochus IV later, in his persecution and his edicts, many of them are directed towards the Sanhedrin itself, not only to the Kohen Gadol. Many of his responses. So we know that it was a recognized body. Now, during this time, and during this entire time, within Judea itself, there is also a gradual Hellenization, what the Gemara calls the Mityevnim. Okay? Now, it's very interesting, by the way, that the Gemara, and very telling, that the Gemara uses Lashon Mityevnim. I mean, the enemy came from Syria, right? Alexander the Great was the last Greek that conquered. We're talking now between Egypt and Syria. Why does the Gemara call them Yevanim? And constantly in the Tefillah we say Malchut Yavan. Because the Hakamim realized that their battle was not only with a foreign power, but with a foreign culture. And that foreign culture is the Greek culture. It made no difference whether the general came from Syria or from Egypt. The battle was the foreign culture, the Hellenization. And that Hellenization took form not only in the form of persecution, but actually throughout this entire period, a gradual Hellenization in Judea starts to take place. Much less on the peasantry. Somewhat on the urban masses, the artisans, the middle class, but on a much higher level, unfortunately, on to the aristocracy, including the Kehuna at times. They became Hellenized. The highest degree, of course, is, as we'll see later, in the Greek cities where you have gymnasiums, which we'll talk about a little bit later. There is a group of people that the Gemara is going to call the Mityevnim, who have a belief that in order for Judaism to enter into modernity, they must accept aspects of Greek culture. There is an even radical element who attempted to reinterpret the Bible in light of Greek mythology. That level of Mityevnim, but that's an extreme level. But there are these Mityevnim running around, Jewish people, who believe that the only way that you can be part of this new world, this new Hellenized world, was for Judaism sort of to evolve. With this approach, and with all these different approaches, of course we know that it was inevitable that we would lead to some form of confrontation. Confrontation is inevitable. In the year 175, Antiochus IV, known as Antiochus Epiphanes, he has the legitimate Onias Kohen Gadol deposed, and Jason, his brother, buys the Kehuna from Antiochus IV. So what Antiochus IV is now doing is literally he is not only deposing one in favor of the other, but it's setting it up that it's for sale. The kehuna is for sale. He's not only disrupting heredity, but he's creating a scenario where corruption and foreign powers decide internal Jewish policy, even in religious positions, because Kohen Gadol was not just a secular, clearly was also a religious position. Now, this Kohen Gadol Jason was, to some degree or another, a Hellenized Jew who believed in Hellenization. He was a mityaven, and he did certain policies. He had certain policies that he enacted and that he established in Judea, which would contribute to the Hellenization of Judea. First of all, he established gymnasiums. Now, for many of us, a gym is not such a bad thing. It's a gym, right? But the Greek gymnasium was the center of its culture. In the Greek gymnasium, first of all, the athletes, were not always clothed, so that clearly could annoy, you would imagine that would be antithetical to our tradition, that clearly would annoy the Hachamim, right? But not only that, it was the center of a culture that spoke about the predominance of the body, the importance of the body, the importance of the physical element, the physical beauty. In other words, the soul was subordinated to the body. The exact opposite message that Judaism speaks about. So in other words, this was a center of culture which was created and which was centered in Judea, which really read counter to the basic beliefs of most Jews. The right that Antiochus gave for every Jew to practice is rescinded by Antiochus IV in the time of Jesus. Jerusalem itself, he attempted to turn it into what's called a Hellenistic polis. That's a Hellenistic city. So we have all these measures that he takes to Hellenize. However, there's a funny thing about Jason. Jason was not, believe it or not, as bad as it sounds, the most radical element of mityaven, of Hellenized Jews. Because he still wanted to leave the temple ritual untouched. In other words, he will, the sacrificial worship, leave that. We don't have to interfere with that. But throughout all of Judea, the culture, the very backbone of the strength of Judaism, that he believed to change. In 171, in an ironic twist, Jason, the person who bought the kehuna, is forced out of the kehuna by another individual who decides that he's going to become the Kohen Gadol, and he also ups the bid. He buys it. And this individual is even much more radical than Jason. His name was Menelaus. And he takes funds from the temple itself. He has no ties to a kehuna family and of the Kohen Gadol. And he takes, and he actually usurps funds from the temple itself to placate Antiochus IV, to placate the Seleucids. This, by the way, will remind us of the first temple incident, the same incident in Beit Rishon, where was it Ahaz? I have to think. That where he actually takes money from the funds to placate the Babylonian king. Nevertheless, some people begin to revolt against Menelaus' act. Right? Some people, they see this, they see already now the interference with the temple worship, this becomes very sensitive. And while it's not a total and absolute revolution yet, there are skirmishes, there is some fighting. The Seleucids come in, they protect their guy, they send in the Syrian army, and the insiders are executed. But the seeds are planted for almost a civil war. And now there is also, it's not only between what we'll term later the Hasidim, those people who wanted to stay close to the tradition, and the Mityavnim, but within the Mityavnim there is dissension between the Jason camp and the Menelaus camp. Menelaus gets even more radical in his attempt to assert authority and control. And he allows the Greeks to introduce foreign deities into the temple itself. Literally, some people believe at this point it gets so bad that the God of Israel could just be part of mythology. Be part of within the Greek culture system. This is too much for most people today. And there begins a revolution of people that are called Hasidim. And again, this is also described in our sources of Sefer Hashmonaim, Hasidim versus the Mitnegdim. I'm sorry, Hasidim. No, that's later. That is a Freudian slip. Hasidim versus the Mityavnim. Right? Hasidim versus the Mityavnim. And the Hasidim here revolt. And in order, as Antiochus IV puts down that revolt, in here is where he issues his famous decrees in the year 167, forbidding Milah, forbidding Kashrut, forbidding the study of Torah, putting actual Avodah Zarah in the Bet HaMikdash, which is true, putting actual Zinut in the Bet HaMikdash, right, harlotry, prostitution, all of these horrible decrees are decreed by Antiochus in an attempt, and as many historians see, as a sort of as a response to the revolt, to the original revolt. And here many historians debate. I mean, this is still part of a debate as sort of what came first, the chicken or the egg. Does the revolt call the persecution? Does the persecution cause the revolt? And here it seems that they're both, because it seems that the internal, and it's very interesting, we see it today in our day also. We see, how often do we see, unfortunately in the state of Israel today, our biggest enemies sometimes are from among us. And we know that prior, and I was there, remember, in the summer, prior to all of this destruction that we're witnessing today, and prior to all the difficult times that we're having today with the Arabs, the Prime Minister clearly issued a secularization. He wanted to secularize the state of Israel. He decided to allow secular marriages. He decided to do away with the Ministry of Religion. You can have debate, you can have discussion, but that process of secularization, which was unprecedented, Ben Gurion himself, was unprecedented. People of the left couldn't believe what they were hearing. It was clearly somebody who saw his political power waning. He didn't even have a government at that point, and we see already, unfortunately, as things happen and things develop. The same thing in ancient times, just to repeat itself. I think part of the answer to part of that question, what came first, the persecutions or the revolution, I think Menelaus' own, we'll call it his own Hellenization, which preceded even Antiochus' edicts, although there were some edicts on the part of Antiochus. But Menelaus himself, as a Mityaven, as a Jew, begins to introduce this, and that causes a revolution, which again then causes the foreign power to go even further. The Seleucid controlling power that dominates to go even further and to introduce those infamous edicts. The edicts of, again, Kashrut, Avodah Zarah, Zenut, Milah, all of these things that are the basic Jewish fundamentals that are being violated on the temple itself. So clearly, many people were annoyed. This, at this point, is where the Hashmonaim band together. The famous family of Matityahu in Modi'in, and his children, Yehuda, Eliezer, Yohanan, Shimon, and Yonatan. His 5 children. They create and they start a revolution under the leadership of Yehuda. Now it's interesting that the name, what they're called Maccabi, Yehuda Maccabi. It's interesting. I mean, tradition has it as Maccabi with a kaf, Micha Mocha Ba'ilim Hashem. However, there are other sources, specifically for some of the Sefer Hashmonaim, that might have with a kof, right? Because Maccabi Milashon Maccabit, which is a hammer. So it's just interesting. This dichotomy. Anyway, nevertheless, under Yehuda's leadership, Yehuda begins a revolution. And he is at this point joined by the Hasidim. So the Hashmonaim, the Hasidim, they revolt against these horrible edicts of Antiochus IV, and they have many battle victories. Many generals are sent, won't go through all of them, and they have many, they do very well originally in battle, and they have many victories. It's unclear, 166 or 165, Matityahu himself dies in the battle, and under Yehuda, they retake Jerusalem. Jerusalem is retaken. Menelaus, at this point, seeks a peace settlement himself, because he realizes that things are getting a little bit difficult. And in the year 164, the rights are restored. The rights that Antiochus III guaranteed to Jews to worship according to their ancestral religion are restored. However, Yehuda is not happy. Yehuda, this is a battle that has lasted for years, and at this point, the Hashmonaim decide to fight for not only being allowed to worship as they want, but almost at this point for independence. Originally, many Hasidim are happy with the scenario, and they lay arms. And in fact, they are granted amnesty. Those people who had fought against the Greeks, at this point are given in an attempt to neutralize the army and the victories of Yehuda, they're promised amnesty. A promise that some take. You know, they are, after all, in the Greek mind, they are war criminals. Here they have a chance to lay down their arms, and they're granted amnesty. However, Yehuda continues to fight, and shortly after, he is rejoined by many of the Hasidim, after all, to this battle. In December of that year, 164, they recapture Yerushalayim, as I mentioned, and on Kaf He B'Kislev, and the year that they recapture Yerushalayim, they purify the temple. They capture the Temple Mount itself, purify it, remove all of the idolatry, and this is the holiday of Hanukah. At this point, I mean, the story is not over yet, but at this point, when we celebrate the holiday of Hanukah, this is really the victory that we're celebrating. The purification of the temple. Now, they have not yet gained independence. Not the battle? Well, the battles that resulted in the purification of the temple. My only point is, independence is yet to come. I mean, they're going to gain it, but the date that we celebrate, Kav He B'Kislev, is the actual main goal is achieved, because this was the main goal, to purify the temple, to remove the edicts of Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV edicts are removed. They are granted religious freedom. They are promised that the edict of Antiochus III will be restored. The temple is rid from all the idolatry that it was put in 3 years ago. Right? So they can go now, they can have milah, they can have the kashrut, the avodah zarah is out of the Bet HaMikdash, they're repurifying the Bet HaMikdash, and not only that, they are now in control of the Bet HaMikdash. They're the de facto power, and we'll see how that happens. So even though the main goal is achieved, however, things don't end. Now it's important to realize, and here's something very interesting. Throughout this entire battle, the mityavnim many of whom were in control, were siding with the Seleucid army. So it wasn't just, this is treacherous. It wasn't just the band of people who wanted to modernize Judaism and who were culturally against the Hashmonaim, or who were, debating a cultural debate as to how much we're going to let foreign culture into Judaism, but literally it was treachery. They were siding with the foreign power. That's very, very important and to some extent because of that, history must judge them with bringing on some of the decrees and the edicts and the persecutions that Antiochus instituted. I don't think they were so upset about it. Now, there are some historians, Bickerman and others, who say they asked for it. They actually requested it from Antiochus. But history has not proven that perfectly. But nevertheless, they have to share the blame for some of the persecutions and the edicts of Antiochus IV. They must take some blame because clearly they were on the side of the Seleucid foreign invasion. They were on the side of the invaders. And that's very, very important to put in perspective, because this was a civil war as much as it was a war for independence. And herein lies a key message that we're going to talk about in the holiday of Hanukah. We must understand this also as part of a civil war. Hanukah represents the victory not only in the throwing out of foreign power, but the victory in the civil war for Judaism's right to exist. Now, there was a garrison of the Greeks. Now, as Yehuda has these victories, these Hellenized Jews seek refuge from whom? From the Greek enclaves that are still in Judea, from the Greek fortresses that the Hashmonaim are trying to rid. That's where they go. So that's also proof that really they were siding with the foreign power. Now, in the year 164, Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, the one who issued the dies. Antiochus V, in an attempt to come to some sort of a compromise and to placate the rebels, executes Menelaus. But instead of placing Yehuda as Kohen Gadol, let's say, or Hashmonai as Kohen Gadol, which would have totally placated the rebels, what does he do? He takes a certain alchemist. Now, this is a moderate Hellenizer. He's not a radical Hellenizer. He's what's called a moderate Hellenizer. It's very difficult to understand what that means. But somehow he must have believed that he would be less detestable to the Hashmonaim than was Menelaus. That must have been Antiochus V's belief, because he is attempting at this point to placate someone. However, of course, this does not make the Hashmonaim happy, and they continue to rebel. In the year 160, Yehuda Maccabi dies in battle. Many people don't realize that Yehuda himself died in this battle, in the battle of the Hashmonaim. Now we're talking after the holiday of Hanukah is in motion, and already, I don't know, actually in motion, but after the date why we celebrate Hanukah, it's already taken place. The battles still continue, because the main victory, of course, of the cleansing of the temple is not in the battles of the Hashmonaim. And Yonatan, the brother, starts to take a control of the revolution. Now, it's very difficult for me to pronounce some of these Greek names. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right or wrong, so I'm going to say the Greek general. He signs a treaty with Yonatan at Michmash, and he gives him power over Judea to Yonatan. Again, under the lordship, so to speak, of the Seleucid Empire. In the year 152, within Syria itself, there is a battle for the ascension of the control of the actual Syrian Empire. Yonatan, through very shrewd diplomatic means, signs with a certain Alexander Beles, who, in his internal civil war, Yonatan is officially appointed now as Kohen Gadol. 152. At that point, this is the beginning of the sovereignty of the Hashmonaim over Eretz Israel. Unfortunately, 9 years later, Yonatan himself is assassinated. He's murdered by a pretender to the Seleucid throne, Tryphon. In 142, his brother Shimon assumes rule. He is recognized by the Syrian ruler at that point, Demetrius II, and he's given a tax exemption for Judea. Now that tax exemption is very important because that represents one of the last vestiges of authority that the Seleucid army and the Seleucid emperor has over Judea. So the exemption of the tax is another, we're going very close to actually, this is the final step in independence. They have cut the umbilical cord. The story should end here. And if the Hashmonaim behaved themselves, the story would have. And we probably may have had a much nicer ending to the story. And this would be the Nitzahon, and this really does summarize the Nitzahon Mamash of the Me'atim Keneged Rabbim. And it's a glorious part in our history. And it's worthy of a holiday like Hanukah. Because this really represents originally the struggle for the right to worship, that, and eventually independence itself from a foreign ruler, as powerful as the Seleucid army. However, things don't end. Shimon in the year 134 is assassinated. Him and his two children are assassinated by his son-in-law, who seems to be instigated by the Seleucid ruler. At this point, the Seleucid ruler is already Antiochus VII. Antiochus VII, even before, when he assumes control, he begins to fight Shimon, little by little. But it really gets to a head when the son-in-law murders, and like I said, probably with the help of the Seleucids, murders Shimon and his two children, his two sons. Maybe he felt that he'd act as a puppet to the Seleucid Empire, as a puppet, and he felt that he might now have some legitimacy in their eyes to control Judea. I don't know about that. However, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because Shimon has a surviving son, Yohanan Hyrcanus, John Hyrcanus, who rules. There's about, for 2 years, doesn't come free. He has a 2 years war with the Seleucids, but the Seleucids themselves are caught up in a war against the Parthians, and so therefore they have no choice but to recognize the rule of John Hyrcanus. Now, by the way, some people, when they listen to some of the historical developments, they get upset. There's some diplomatic maneuvering also, and some, there's an internal struggle in Syria, and that's part of how we get independence. But that doesn't diminish the miracle, because the timing is key. If you look at the miracle, at the right time, things fall into place. At the right time, there's internal struggles in Syria, and so therefore, this small, tiny country who couldn't dream of independence, through yet miraculous battles, miracles that really haven't been repeating themselves until our generation, but also through timing that is also very important to our survival. And things happen and things fall into place. One has to see God's hand in that too. Not only in the military victories, but even in some of the diplomatic ones as well. One must see God's hand in all of this. This is all miraculous. Again, so because of their own, the Seleucid struggle against the Parthians, who were a major empire and a major, which represented a major threat to the Seleucid Empire, they are forced to recognize the rule of Yohanan Hurkinus, John Hurkinus. Now this John Hurkinus is also a peculiar individual. He clearly begins as with the same heritage, the anti-Hellenistic heritage of the Hashmonaim. He is identified by some as the Yohanan Kohen Gadol in the Gemara, who 80 years was Kohen Gadol and entered Lifnai v'Lifnim, but on the 80th year, Parash went to became Hellenized, and of course, according to the Hakamim, died in the Kodesh Kodashim. So in other words, he himself, this Yohanan Hurkinus, who's a Hashmonaim, I mean, it's one generation after, really. Yes, there have been brothers, but this is the son. This is the next generation. And already you see the seeds themselves in the Hashmonaim themselves of some form of Hellenization that they themselves gave their lives to oppose. In the year 129, Antiochus VII dies. The Seleucid Empire collapses. There's complete independence for Judea. Yohanan Hurkinus also enters into a policy of expansion. And he has many conquests. He conquers the Edomians, the Edom. Conquers and forcibly converting many. He conquers the Samaritans. And he becomes the Hashmonaim now enter into a policy of expansion of the borders. Successfully. And there's no Seleucid mighty empire checking them. They now are totally independent. And Judea becomes a powerful state. After his death, Yehuda Aristobulus I assumes the throne. Following him, a very interesting individual takes over. In the year 103, the rule of the next Hashmonaim, Alexander Yanai. Okay, the brother of Aristobulus. Now here is an interesting fact. Yehuda Aristobulus was married to a woman named Shilomit, who was later termed by Hachamim as Shalom Sion. Peace to Zion, right? When Aristobulus dies, Yanai, Aristobulus' brother, performs the mitzvah of Yibum, marrying Shalom Sion. And it's interesting, because as we're going to hear in a few minutes, Yanai was far from someone who represents the best of Jewish tradition. It's an interesting Yibum. I mean, this is someone like, you could imagine the one who's like, we're going to see what he actually did and what he instituted. I mean, he was extremely Hellenized. He, in fact, the Hakamim, tell stories, many stories in the Gemara about his evil, and in fact, his Hellenization, his sympathy for the Sedukim, the class that opposed, the famous class that opposed the Torah Shebaal Peh, that opposed the Pirushim. The Pirushim were the class of the Hakamim. And it's worth it for me to digress for a minute to explain what that was about. Because there are many misunderstandings. The class that later became the forerunner of the Hakamim were called the class of the Pirushim. Okay? We won't get into why they were named that, Pirushim. There were Poresh from the Isur, there were many. But clearly, this was the class of the believers of the tradition upholding of Torah Shebaal Peh. The Sedukim, taking the name of Sadok, right? And the Hachamim in Pirkei Avot say, the students of Sadok Ubaitus, who were students of Antignos Isocho, who went off the derech. The Sedukim, they were generally an aristocratic class, a privileged class, who had, unfortunately, at some point inroads in the Kihuna, and they were the opponents of Torah Shebaal Peh. And in general, it's no accident that it wasn't, as I said, purely an ideological battle, because they were also the most Hellenized. And history is replete with many battles and not actually war battles, but debates between the Siddukim and the Perushim. It's not an actual civil war. I would call it a class struggle. They don't actually take arms. Okay? There's no actual battles. Right. Although people die. The famous with Yanai, it came to a head where he is reported to have executed many of the Hachamim. The Shimon ben Shetach, the one who escapes, because it happens to be his brother-in-law, Shlom Sion's brother. So he escapes with his life. And the Gemara records that at one point, Alexander and I had to call him back, and he was afraid for his life. And he had to, until he got the final promise that he will not be killed. So Yanai did murder many of the Hachamim. There's the famous story of Sukkot, where he was pelted by the Perushim with etrogim, because and that whole ceremony, and that also resulted in him murdering many of the Hachamim. But he was totally Hellenistic. And here comes the final irony. We're talking in the year 103. This is not a long time after the Battle of the Hashmonaim. 60, 70 years. And their own descendant actually is part of the Hellenization of Judea. This is it's a tremendous irony. They gave their lives, they fought to prevent the Hellenization of Judea. And now we see that here their descendant Alexander Yanai is the most Hellenized. He's a Hashmonaim. It is tremendously ironic. It's tragic also. Now, even those Hellenized Hashmonaim did have their opponents. First of all, there's, as always, more extreme Hellenists. But they did not represent a real threat. But the great opponents at this point of the Hashmonaim are from the Perushim themselves, because of who Yanai was. In the year 76, Yanai dies. Yanai dies in the year 76, and he is succeeded by his wife, Shlomit, who is Shlom Sion, who sides with the Perushim. And this is recorded as times as a good time for the Perushim. Okay, and so during the rule of the wife, she is of course the sister of Shimon ben Shetach, and so therefore all seems to be well for the Perushim. However, at her death, there's a debate. Did she clearly appoint the successor or not? Regardless of whether she did or not, there is a struggle between her two children, Hutkinus II and Aristobulus II. Right? And they have a civil war as to who is going to be in control of Judea. And as the Gemara says, Hutkinus b'bifrim, Hutkinus inside, Aristobulus b'chutz. Aristobulus is trying to control, and Hutkinus is inside. And Hutkinus makes one of the history will record it as one of the most tragic mistakes that any ruler of Judea ever made. In the year 63, he asks the Romans for help. And in 63, before the Common Era, Pompey marches into Rome and helps Hutkinus. He supports Hutkinus, but not as a true ruler, as a puppet. And the Hashmona'i rulers, following this point, have almost no power amongst themselves, by themselves. They are merely rulers that are put in by the Romans. And in fact, the Romans ensured this by having their advisors to the Hashmona'i ruler, in place. And they're the ones really with the power. One such famous advisor was named Antipater. Antipater is an Edomi. Right? Antipater is an advisor, quote unquote, to the Roman, to the Hashmonaim, of course with clearly strong Roman tendencies. And while this develops more, I mean, really, for our intents and purposes, the history that we want to discuss really ends. I mean, of course, the history of Judea continues. And just with a very quick review of that is, yes, Antipater is an advisor. Antipater has a very interesting son. His son is named Hordus, Herod, who happens to have been a general in the Galilee, who puts down some, because there are groups of people who are unhappy with this Roman influence, groups of zealots that Josephus writes about, who really want to rid the Roman influence. And part of Herod's job at the Galilee was to put down a lot of these rebellions. Herod was not a Hashmonaim. Antipater wasn't a Hashmonaim. Antipater was an Edomi who was an advisor to the Hashmonaim, who was invested with real power from Rome. When Herod later assumes the throne and executes the last vestiges of the Hashmonaim dynasty is over. Now don't forget, Herod also marries Hashmonaim for legitimacy, Miriam, and he kills her. He executes his own wife. It was very, very paranoid. And he, that's why he built what he built. He built Masada. Masada, which was also ironic, I mean, Jewish history is also ironic. It was built by Herod, who was pro-Roman, to escape zealots, if he needed to. It was used after the destruction of the temple by zealots who were trying to escape the Romans after the destruction of the temple. And finally, the famous Masada, the death of the inhabitants in the year 73 after the Common Era. But really in the year 63 before the Common Era, that's when really the Hashmonaim are still in power. They're still officially the kings, but their true independence is compromised. And eventually, of course, as Herod assumes the throne, it's over. The Hashmonaim dynasty is over. By the way, history also has some ironies in that he is summoned. Herod at one point was summoned before he is assumed power. He's summoned before whom? He's summoned before the Sanhedrin and the Avbidin. It's unclear whether it was Shemaiah or Shammai. The Avbidin stands up and says, if you don't judge him now, he will eventually judge you. And he is assisted in, and by the way, when he appears before the court, he appears in full army gear. And he's assisted to escape by the last Hashmonaim, the king who fears him. Nevertheless, Herod, when he takes control, he is as we know, a ferocious ruler. He's not someone who the Hachamim were fond of. And that being the case, really his rule does represent an end to Hashmonaim rule. Even in other words, if you'd say in 63 to total independent Hashmonaim rule, when Herod takes the throne, there is the end of Hashmonaim rule. Because on Herod's death, there is a brief period where his sons attempt to rule ineffectively, because Herod was a very effective leader. He may not have been someone who he would be totally proud of, but a strong leader. But his children were not. And eventually the Romans march in, and the era of the procurators begin, where the Roman procurators actually rule Judea directly. The most evil of them would be the last one, the most famous one, who is Florus. Florus is the one who, through his harsh and cruel persecution of the Jews, begins the revolution. Under his rule begins the revolution, which actually destroyed the entire temple. The temple was destroyed. But again, that's, not so much where I wanted to go. go. I wanted to stay more and to show you the Hashmona'i dynasty. And really to put Hanukah in perspective historically, because first of all, many times people wonder about, not that the words of our Hachamim need any testimony, but it's nice to know that historical documents do support what's given us. These things really did happen. I've been quoting to you from documents that are accepted by historians. I mean, not that we need any proof for that, but it's very important to us. But more importantly, when we understand this, we can now put Hanukah in interesting perspective. That it was not just that battle for independence. It was a battle, first and foremost, for religious existence. Again, when that's achieved, the battle doesn't end, because they do battle for independence. But, as I said before, it's a civil war as much as it is a war of independence. And it was largely against those Midyavnim, those Hellenized Jews, who wanted to compromise what our goals and what our job in this world is really all about. And I always say it's a very interesting point that it always fits with the time of Yosef. It always fits with the time of Yosef. Because Yosef really represents that. Yosef represents the Jew who's thrust into a foreign culture. The foreign culture of the time. Mitzrayim. The center of that, what we call decadence or clearly power. He is thrust as an Ivri. And the Torah tells us that the Mitzrayim detested the Ivri. He's put in right, they wouldn't even eat with them. He's put in a very difficult position. Even through his difficult position, he is able to excel in that society without compromising an iota of his values, of his tradition, of Yaakov, the famous Midrashim that say, when he even would come close to thinking about the Averah, what would he see? He would see the face of Yaakov Avinu when he couldn't do any Averah. It was that past that enabled him, that remembering where he came from, to succeed in that society without any compromise. And the Hashmonaim represent something very similar. The Midyavnim are all about, if we are going to survive in this new world, if we're going to succeed, then Judaism must be compromised. So we must Hellenize Judaism. And the Hashmonaim said, no. We can be a strong power without that. Yosef represents almost the first Galut, right? And the Hashmonaim represent the Galut very different. On the Galut Yavan is different than all the other Galuyot. All the other Galuyot, we are taken away. The Bet HaMikdash is destroyed. We're taken into another country. Galut Yavan, the Galut in the time of the Hashmonaim, was the Galut on our soil without the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash, entering into the Bet HaMikdash. And that Galut was about some of the same message that Yosef teaches. And I always say it's very interesting that in reality, if you look at it, it's the only Galut Yavan, the only Galut where the enemy enters into us, into our domain. And Hanukah is the only holiday where we have a mitzvah, not only to remember the Nes, but to mifarsem the Nes, to show the miracle, to show it to the world. The holiday that they attempted to come in is the only holiday where we go out and show the miracle. Pursum HaNes and Hanukah. It's not one holiday when we talk about Pursum HaNes. We talk about Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim. We talk about to remember internally, but Lefarsem et HaNes, specifically on Nerot Hanukah. Right, they come in, we go out. So I think that's a key. And so therefore, we really can be aided by a proper historical perspective to understand also the part of the true message of what Hanukah really represents. A struggle for religious existence against internal and external enemies who wish to change what we're all about. Sort of the first Reformed Jews that we would have encountered in Jewish history. Baruch Adonai Olam, Amen.